Hello, my name is Sean Spear. I'm an assistant professor at the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy and the project co-director of the Ontario 360 project, a project dedicated to translating academic scholarship to the real-world challenges facing the province of Ontario. As viewers may know, we've been releasing a series of policy papers over the past several weeks focused on the pandemic and post-pandemic planning in the province of Ontario, and this week is no different. We've released a new paper by the co-founder and principal of Springboard Policy, Noah Zahn, on communicating policy in a crisis, lessons for Ontario policymakers. And I'm pleased to be here today with him and my project co-director, Drew Fagan, to talk about Noah's analysis and recommendations for Ontario policymakers as we continue to grapple with the immediacy of the public health and economic challenges stemming from COVID-19. Noah, thanks for being here. Drew, it's always good to have you here. Why don't we get started with the conversation about both the kind of context and the analysis of Noah's paper, and ultimately the recommendations for Ontario policymakers.
Yeah, Noah, why don't you, and thank you, Sean, and Noah, thank you for being here. Take us through the paper at a high level, if you would. And if I was to boil it down, I think I would say that your assessment is that during this crisis, communications has been even more important, or certainly as important as it's ever been. And the quality of communications in certain ways has actually been better in the healthcare aspects of the COVID crisis, which after all are fundamental, rather than the economic response to the COVID crisis. Perhaps you could take us through the paper at that level and then give us your assessment of why that is, if you think that's true.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Drew, and thanks, Sean, as well. So the motivation in coming at this research paper was looking at the economic portion of the crisis response and coming from the premise that communications is clearly not tangential to, and it's not a nice to have about the economic policy response, but it's actually core to the implementation into the actual success of the economic policy response. And that's a conversation, as you alluded to, Drew, that we've been having around especially the public health measures across the country and here in Ontario, and the strengths and weaknesses of the communications of those public health measures. I think we can point to some successes and to some failures, but we haven't looked at the economic policy response with that same kind of scrutiny, because we typically don't look at our economic policy with a priority on communications. But from the perspective of small businesses and of individuals and households who are the targets of these initiatives, these economic rescue packages, the communications is essential. And I think we can see that in the way things have played out.
It's such an interesting point, Noah, this idea that communications and policy are actually inextricably linked. Viewers might be asking themselves, why would a policy-oriented research initiative like Ontario 360 be confronting the issue of communication so directly? And I think, what the paper shows is that communications it has to be a core part of policy development and policy implementation in all circumstances, but particularly in a pandemic. In normal circumstances, I think, for instance, of some of the research that's been done that shows the poor take-up of certain public programs because of a lack of awareness or public information. And of course, that is only heightened in the context of a crisis. Do you want to just talk a bit, Noah, about how communications and policy go together, and the extent to which I think the paper observes that the need for communications, solid communications, is even more crucial in a crisis like COVID-19.
Yeah, absolutely, Sean. And it relates to that question of take up. But I think when we unpack that a little bit, it's that can seem rather superficial. Are people aware of a program and convinced that it's got some merits? But what these economic rescue packages and what economic policy is often trying to do is influence expectations and longer run behavior of businesses. So to get concrete about that, if we think about the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy, or the couple of emergency rent programs, the federal and provincial ones that have come out over the course of the crisis, and which I touch on in this paper. The purpose of these is try to get businesses to commit to staying open and to keep as much of their staff on payroll as possible, so that they'll maintain those long-term labor market connections, so that employees will continue to have benefits as not just the emergency income that might come in, for example, from CERB, and to make sure that those businesses are going to be in a position to reopen and more strongly and more quickly once we're through this pandemic. That requires a certain amount of trust and building into that expectations planning as businesses plan their next few steps. If you're a small business owner, even if you're incorporated, you may be on the hook personally for your lease, for your premises. And so if you're looking at whether or not you're going to be able to afford to stay open, you're not just looking at whether your business can afford it, you're looking at the potential of personal bankruptcy as well. So there's obviously a certain amount of risk aversion that needs to be built in there. So if you're thinking about staying open on the basis of a rent subsidy, you need to know that clearly, that you trust that this is going to be there for you, you know what you can expect from it, and you know how long you can expect for it. And that's just to touch on an example there, I think a good example of where communications have failed. The initial program had been announced in late April through the first 3 months of the pandemic, including going back to the beginning of April. Okay, it's hard to come up with an entirely new program from scratch. The delays in designing these programs, I think, have been relatively short, given how hard it is to design massive new programs from scratch. I have a lot of sympathy on that front. But the subsequent rollout, there was only a guarantee till the end of June. Well, businesses didn't know until June 30th whether the program was going to kick in again for the beginning of July. Well, at that point, rent is due July 1st, and you have to have made those decisions already. And that's a cycle we've repeated a couple of times already, again, on the rent program, similarly on the wage subsidy, and it's happening again. You know, at the beginning of this week, we've had some confirmation on both of those programs, but we only know what they're going to look like until December 19th at this point, about 3.5 weeks away. And so obviously, if you're a business deciding how you're going to weather this pandemic winter, you need a little bit more forward planning if you're going to decide to rely on these things. And a relatively opaque, it's not just the lack of details, but the fact that it's been opaque and sudden shifts from governments means that you're, as a business decision maker, less likely to rely on a vaguer promise of there's going to be some sort of program and we promise it's going to be a good one and we're going to be there for you. Businesses need details, at least some sort of number or some sort of range of numbers to plug into a budget.
So timeliness is fundamental, clarity, and you focus in these two examples on the lack of timeliness. I want to ask you actually about a third example that you write about, because the two we've just been talking about businesses, a little closer to home, literally, and that is with regard to school reopenings and how they were going to reopen. Take us through, before we get to the recommendations, which you write about in quite a bit of detail, that third example and how well the government did in your mind with regard to education.
Yeah, absolutely. And so what the case study we were looking at here in the paper was taking us back to the summer, to July and August, when schools had been closed for the remainder of the last school year, and parents were looking to understand what options and what was going to be available to them come September. And so there were timelines laid out by the government that were then preempted by the government's own announcements, and details being negotiated with school boards up until the beginning of September. So if you're a family deciding whether or not you're going to send a younger child back to school in person, there was no clarity about contingency planning. There was no sense of whether you're going to be able to shift to virtual school if things got worse. And so if you have to make the decision of, well, I'm not sure I'm going to be comfortable sending my child to school, a lot of parents had to make the decision to say, okay, we need to make a plan that's going to allow one of us to be at home and take care of our child and help them with online learning, which is, of course, we know that burden has been borne almost entirely by women. And so it's pushed a significant amount of women with young children out of the labor force. Now, I think that I don't want to overemphasize communications there, in which the core driver is that parents have been uncomfortable sending their children back to school, but the ability to build that confidence that we're going to have this plan, this is how we're going to respond if things change, and this is how we're going to keep you comfortable and safe, that came too late and with too little effort to have a two-way conversation to assuage parents' concerns, in addition to the actual school reopening plan. And that has meant people pushed out of the labor force with, for who knows how long, and they're going to suffer long-term labor market scarring as a result.
Well, one of the interesting things about your paper, Noah, is how it aligns with the second paper we released as part of this series on the extent to which we're facing unprecedented uncertainty in our society due to the pandemic. Now, that paper focused principally on the uncertainty for policymakers and the difficulty in crafting policy in light of the evolving situation. But I think one of the compelling points you make in the paper, and both here, is that policymakers also need to think about the uncertainty that households and businesses are experiencing. And one of the things you talk about in the paper is the potential to use something like the forward guidance model that central bankers use to try to mitigate uncertainty by signaling, in the case of central bankers, to the market their thinking and intentions, but in this case, signaling to businesses and household the intentions or scenarios that the government is considering as part of its policy response. Do you want to talk a bit about the idea of scenario planning and the use of triggers for the enactment of different policies, and the extent to which this approach can help businesses and households carry out the kind of planning that you're talking about, given the just enormous uncertainty that they're facing?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think those two factors absolutely go hand in hand that you brought up, Sean. And it's the uncertainty that policymakers face is creating policy uncertainty and pushing policy uncertainty onto businesses and households. And these aren't normal times. In normal times, we expect governments to come out with clear, definitive plans about what they're going to do and how it's going to work. But sharing some of that uncertainty and having a little bit more of a conversation can be quite helpful. So when we talk about scenarios and triggers here, take the rent subsidy or the wage subsidy, for example. Right now, we only know what the program design looks like through the end of December, because in principle, those programs could be scaled back if the economy or the pandemic are improving. Of course, those two things go hand in hand, as was the plan for the wage subsidy. What the government hasn't successfully done is made clear at what level are we going to, what is going to drive us to start scaling those back? What's going to drive us to keep those in place? I think it's pretty easy to say that right now, it is unlikely that the government of Canada is going to significantly scale back the wage subsidy by mid-December, given where we are. But for some reason, that's not being communicated in any fashion. So wage scenarios and triggers can work. Looking further out than that, of course, could be to say, we expect that we're going to follow roughly this path of recovery, and if we are at this stage of recovery, whether that's measured in the public health scenario, whether that's measured in economic indicators, unemployment, or other metrics on that front, that is going to be the trigger once we cross a threshold like this. And the more definitive, the easier it is, perhaps for businesses. But even if they are more about ranges, at least if the government can contribute the factors of those thinking, that gives more information for businesses to say, okay, I know that if things aren't improving, that the government has committed that they're going to keep things at a certain level. And that doesn't require me as a cafe owner to be, coming up with my own projections of where unemployment's going to be or tracking those numbers, but at a pretty basic level to say things are at least as bad as they were, and therefore I can factor in that the rent subsidy is still going to be there for February pretty confidently.
Drew, may I just say something quick in response to that? As someone who was involved in stimulus programming at the federal level between 2009 and 2011, I think one of the other virtues of setting out these triggers by which policy will expand or phase out is that it will help to deal with the kind of inherent political economy challenges in making those decisions. Back in 2011, there were big questions about whether the stimulus ought to continue or ought to expire. And those decisions ultimately, took on a kind of political dynamic. Had the government instead said the stimulus will continue to remain in place subject to the kind of following economic conditions, and in effect made those decisions more formulaic, it would have mitigated the inherent kind of political economy challenges with either ramping up or ramping down extraordinary spending. And so it seems to me not only is there upside for businesses and households to have a better sense of the trajectory of these extraordinary programs, it may ultimately help policymakers as they take action to phase out extraordinary spending and return to something like a more normal fiscal policy. I don't know if you want to comment on that. I know Drew probably has other questions as well.
Go ahead, Noah.
Yeah, so I'd absolutely agree with that, and I'd argue that not only would that have likely significant relevance in this crisis, where I'm certainly hopeful that we'll be in a very different position with vaccine news by some point in next year, and we're not going to see wave after wave, but I could be wrong, but certainly for the next crisis as well, whatever that looks like. And it may not be a public health crisis, but the idea of some kinds of triggers, they don't quite create automatic stabilizers in the sense of governments will be bound to come up with the next crisis with the response to this crisis, because that will likely not be appropriate, but to start to give a framework to make some of these decisions clearer and easier. And if those frameworks are on the books and we can expect some level of government response, perhaps we don't see the same level of economic contraction in the immediate response to a crisis if there's an understanding that there will be a certain kind of government response to a certain kind of crisis, this kind of exogenous shock, to businesses.
So we've talked about the critique, if you like, and moved into your recommendations, and talked in terms of recommendations in particular with regard to triggers, forward guidance, if you like, and how those interreact, and as well the fundamental need for time limits. I want to ask you about level in terms of communications, because public policy has become so complex in certain areas, and certainly complex in the area of public health and in the context of this public health crisis. But the need to explain circumstances, immediate and in the future, simply is fundamental as well for a society where there's so many different ways to digest information, or the capacity to digest information. Talk about that, if you would, a little bit, because I know you got into it in the paper.
Yeah, and I think that's an area where I think it's not one or the other, but that the governments need to be comfortable and proactive about reaching out at different kinds of levels of information. Right now, we tend to have two basic levels of government communication. There's the overarching press release, which might also be the top level comments at the press conference of a senior leader, which is generally, we have a new program, it's going to be fantastic. These are all the reason, these are some high level principles of what we're doing. And then there's some degree of technical backgrounder. Now, these programs are by nature somewhat complicated because you have to make complicated programs if you want to take into account nuance and circumstances. The Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy has, a full alphabet of algebra in there. It's got a kind of formula and options that like only an accountant could love. And you need to have that information out there, but you also need to be, I think, proactive at translating that as much as possible, whether it's through providing calculators the same way governments have been pretty good about providing sort of understand what you might be eligible for individuals. The versions of those for businesses right now during the pandemic are not fantastic. If you want, that's hard to do quickly. Doesn't mean we shouldn't be aspiring for it. But in the meantime, and in addition to that, I think it would be quite helpful to have some proactive outreach to the people that small businesses and households are actually going to be relying on for information to translate this for them. The most obvious place I would go would be the accountants. So go out to the, CPA Ontario and whomever, have a conversation with them about providing information and also clarifying confusion proactively instead of waiting, 2 weeks in and having this come up, in the legislature or in the House of Commons because there's been concerns raised that way. And, those also could be industry associations, local chambers of commerce, any of the groups that have the trust of different businesses and residents and can also help governments to get the message out as much as possible and clarify that message.
Right. I keep on my wall a quote from Einstein: if you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it well enough. And there's much truth in that, even, particularly with complex information. We're probably winding down. Is there anything that we haven't covered in your paper? I know it's gotten a lot of attention, including in the media, that you want to highlight that we really haven't touched on as yet.
So I think just one comment I'd make in maybe in closing is that this critique of communications is not about the clarity of one minister's comments or one leader's comments and whether or not any of them are more or less effective. I'll leave that for the communications experts who like to analyze these kinds of things. Certainly we have public leaders with different communication styles, and to the conversation we're just having, some of those are probably more or less effective for different audiences. It's about how this entire system of government communications to businesses and households work.
Right.
In normal times, we have this carefully staged get the details firm, and then have a rollout with a message calendar and all of that. There's a lot that's good about that in normal times. There's a lot that we could take some of these lessons from the pandemic out to normal times as well. But it's about how our institutions at all levels of government are comfortable and uncomfortable communicating with the public, and the importance of prioritizing getting the message out effectively, because you can have, as we saw with the wage subsidy in particular, a massive, generous program that has fairly low take-up because the message of getting it out there comes with confusion and delays.
It's about structuring systems as opposed to individuals. Sean.
Yeah, I was just going to say, this has been a tremendous conversation, Noah, and I think for policymakers or policy students at the Monk School watching this video, I think one of the crucial takeaways, and this certainly resonates with my experience in government, is that communications can't become part of the conversation after the policy choices have been made. That communications really ought to be a part of that process, thinking about the design, the timing, the communications channels. All of these things are crucial ultimately to the effective implementation of public policy. And as you say, Noah, that's even heightened in the context of a crisis. And so I think it's an important lesson that we'll try to string through subsequent papers that we publish at the Ontario 360 Project. To what extent is thinking about communications ultimately crucial to whether these important policy reforms are successful or lacking. So thank you so much for your contribution. Hopefully, it's something that policymakers take to heart. Given as you said at the outset, it seems likely we're going to be in a world of extraordinary policy intervention for the foreseeable future. Thank you, Noah. Thank you, Drew. Thank you for viewers. We'll have another Ontario 360 Project video in the coming days, and so stay tuned to this channel, and you can go to on360.ca to find Noah's paper and the other papers that we're publishing over the course of this 2020-2021 season of the Ontario 360 Project. Thank you very much.